me Sally if you want. I'm a master's student at Simon Fraser University up in Vancouver in Canada, and I'm here to talk about a research project that I did in collaboration with my lab mates at the iSpace lab and my supervisor, Bernard Rieke. And instead of squeezing an entire paper into a talk, I decided rather to focus on the whys and the main ideas and main motivations, starting with why do I care about this? And I care about this because spatial updating is amazing. It's an absolutely amazing process in our mind that allows us to walk around without getting lost and disoriented. Because as you walk around, it instantly and automatically and effortlessly updates your position and rotation continuously. And I love this, and it's such an amazing thing that I want to study it more. Which brings us to the research problem, which is that spatial updating is amazing, but in virtual reality it's not so amazing. When people navigate in virtual environments, they tend to get lost and disoriented much more quickly than they do in the real world. And this can have negative effects for the usefulness of many users of VR. And so what's missing? Well, one thing that's missing is the physical motion cues. We don't move around physically in VR the same way as we do in the real world. And there is indeed a lot of research that suggests that not only are physical motion cues helpful in triggering spatial updating, this process that keeps us oriented, but they are in fact necessary. So with spatial, you have to have physical motion cues to trigger spatial updating, and without physical motion cues, you don't get spatial updating. And this motivated my supervisor, Bernard Rieke, and his colleagues to investigate and ask whether this is always the case, and specifically ask whether the type of visuals mattered when you're asking whether visuals alone can trigger spatial updating or not. And so they looked at and compared the typical type of visuals called optic flow, a low fidelity type of visual where you can notice motion, but you can't recognize anything and it doesn't look like anything. And they compared it to a much more naturalistic and structured environment, and found that indeed, only with optic flow, people stayed without spatial updating was not triggered. But with the naturalistic visuals and without any physical motion cues, they managed to trigger spatial updating in participants after rotations. And that brings us to this study, because as they focused on rotations, they had participants sit in a chair in front of a screen watching the naturalistic visuals. And after rotating, they were asked to point joystick to targets that they had seen but did not see anymore after rotating in the virtual environment. And I want to make it clear, they didn't rotate physically, they only rotated in the virtual environment. And this study adds to this line of research by adding translations into the mix and having participants not only rotate but also translate and then point to different targets. And so the research question becomes, when moving along a path in a naturalistic virtual city without landmarks, are physical rotations still needed to enable automatic spatial updating, or can the visuals alone suffice? And to do this, we used the amazing motion simulator that we recently built in our lab. And we did some programming to allow us to spin it around with software. And we built this city with 10 separate street segments with 5 levels of curvature from 10 degrees to 170 degrees in either direction. And we sat participants in a chair with a head-mounted display showing them the environment. And in their lab, they had a modified joystick to point to targets. And in each trial, they were passively moved from a starting point at each segment, and they could look around with motion tracking. And at the end of the segment, they were asked to point back as quickly and accurately as possible to the starting point of that segment. And to answer the research question that was investigating the effects of the physical motion cues, we had two conditions. First one, called visual-only turn, where they didn't move physically at all. They only watched the movement and pointed as if they had moved in the virtual world, but there were no physical rotations. And the other one, for real turn, they physically rotated as they rotated in the virtual world at the exact same speed and acceleration. And looking at the data, we found many interesting things, but in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on two of them here. When we were looking at the absolute pointing error between those two conditions, the visual-only turn and the real turn, we found that 2 participants out of the 12 that we tested showed wildly different pointing behavior than the other 10. And they pointed as if they had never updated their rotations. So they always pointed consistently as if they were still facing the original direction that they started in each trial. And this is a known phenomenon, and so we categorized them as non-turners. But what was especially surprising about this is that they did this, these 2 participants, even in the conditions where they physically rotated. And to the best of our knowledge, this is the first time this has been observed in this kind of research. And there's a lot more discussion on this in the paper, and to be honest, this could be a whole talk on its own. So I'm going to move on to the other interesting finding, interesting to us at least, that when we looked at the differences in pointing errors between for the turners, between those two conditions, the visual only and the real turn, and keeping in mind that spatial updating should always trigger, physical motion cues should always trigger spatial updating, we expected that when they were physically rotated, they would get spatial updating triggered more easily, and they would point better, showing that they are better oriented in space and they know better where they are in relation to the starting point that they're pointing to. And as you can see, there was no difference whatsoever. So we found that adding the physical motion cues did not improve pointing performance. And why is that interesting? It's interesting because we expected, and the literature predicted, that it should, but it didn't. And we have 2 possible explanations for this. One is that the visual cues did not trigger spatial updating, and for some reason the physical cues didn't either, which we find unlikely because of what I just explained. The other explanation that we find more likely is that the visual cues, being naturalistic and highly structured, had already triggered spatial updating in both conditions, so that the physical cues had nothing to improve. However, this is speculation, and to actually answer this question, we are currently planning and setting up a follow-up study where we add a condition where the visuals are optic flow, a low-fidelity optic flow where spatial updating should definitely not be triggered without any physical motion cues. And with data from that, we can hopefully pull apart these 2 effects from these 2 factors, the level of how naturalistic the visuals are, and whether you get physical motion cues or not. Now, I started this presentation by telling you why I care, and I'm going to finish it by telling you why you might care. Now, you might care because it's pure science. We are studying the mind, and knowing more about the mind is good. You might also care because of how the pure science feeds into the applied science, because VR is a lot about tricking the mind and making it think that something virtual is real. And knowing more about this mind can allow us to make better VR simulators that are more realistic and more immersive and more effective in whatever they try to do. And finally, you might care about this because of how the applied feeds back into the pure research, because when we're doing spatial cognition research, as we do in our lab, VR is an amazing research tool. It allows us to set up experiments that we couldn't dream of setting up in the real world. And so with better VR simulators that are more realistic and more immersive, we can set up better experiments that gives us better data and allows us to know more about the mind, which then feeds back into the loop when it allows us to make even better VR simulators, and so on. And this loop is what drives our research at the iSpace Lab, and what brings me here today. I'll leave this demo video of the motion simulator up, but otherwise I thank you for your attention, and I'll take any questions you have.